Secret of the Indian, Chapter 9, Tamsin Drives a Bargain. Remember, Tamsin is Emma's sister, Tamsin. By the time Omri and Emma arrived at Emma's house, half of Omri's allotted hour had passed and he was getting panicky. Emma didn't make things easier. What are we going to say about Patrick not coming back? Omri liked the way she said we, making him feel less alone with his problems, but he didn't want to confront this one. How indeed was he to explain to Patrick's absence? Perhaps he could play both ends, so to speak, against the middle. If each household, his and Emma's, though Patrick was in the other one, thought that Patrick was in the other one, Patrick might not be missed for some time. But for a really lousy liar like Omri, it was bound to be tricky. Would your parents understand where you were if you just didn't show up? Probably most parents would not. Patrick's mother was practically on the doorstep to meet them. Well, where is he? She asked without even saying hello. Emma turned to look at Omri expectantly. I came to explain, he said. You see, he swallowed harder. Her eyes were piercing him. He had to drop his. He couldn't look at her in the eye. We went into Richmond Park this morning to look for chestnuts on our bike. Patrick's bike is at home in the country. I mean, he used Gillen's, and we were playing, and he got a bit lost, and I got fed up waiting and came home without him. I expect he'll be back soon, he said hastily, as Patrick's mother rolled her eyes, gritted her teeth, and uttered a kind of a snort. How like him to do the disappearing act just when I want him. Doesn't he realize we're going home today? What am I supposed to do? I have to leave. Couldn't Patrick stay with us for a few days? Don't be silly. What about school? It's school tomorrow. She was obviously infuriated, and Omri couldn't exactly blame her. However, there was nothing to be done for the moment, so leaving her seething in the doorway, Emma pulled Omri past and into the small living room. Leave Tamsin to me, she whispered. She absolutely hates you for some reason. Omri felt rather hurt, even though it was entirely mutual. Tamsin was slumped in front of the small television set, watching some middle-of-the-day rubbish. Her leg, encased from foot to knee in a white plaster cast, was resting on a poof. She didn't even look up as they came in, and Emma coughed. Hey, Tam, want to add to your skiing fund? Fat chance of skiing when I'm like this, she said sourly. You could go at Easter. Best snow's always in April. Tamsin looked up sharply at that, and seeing Omri, her eyes narrowed. You look like a right idiot in that bandage, she remarked. Did someone give you a clout? Not since you, Omri retorted. Tamsin had the grace to blush. She turned back to her sister. What about my skiing fund? Well, you know, your birthday models. I already said no, said Tamsin. I won't swap. Emma shrugged with wondrous carelessness. I just fancy one or two of them, that's all. I'll buy them off of you. Tamsin glanced at Omri again. Is it anything to do with him? Who? Oh, no, of course not. You know I wanted them yesterday. Tamsin's eyes looked beady. If you wait till tomorrow, you could buy the same set at the model shop. I know, but I need them now, Emma said, although she tried to sound careless. Tamsin uncurled herself slowly and frowned. Without a word, she heaved her cast onto the floor and stumped out of the room. Omri almost felt sorry for her, but this charitable impulse was soon to pass. Emma nudged him, and they waited. And after a few minutes, Tamsin returned, carrying the box Omri recognized from last night. She opened it and displayed the contents, and the figures, held to a cardboard backing with elastic, dangled tantalizingly before their eyes. Omri's eyes flew to the surgeon in green operating theater gear, complete with a table and tiny instruments, mere pinhole blobs. And there were two other doctors, one in a white coat with a stethoscope, and the other, also in green, who was evidently part of the surgical team. It was as much as Omri could do to restrain his hand from darting towards them. Instead, he thrust both hands into his pocket and turned away to gaze blindly at the TV set while negotiations between the twins proceeded. They seemed to take forever, and somehow Tamsin could sense that Emma's casualness masked some urgent desire from the medical models. In the end, though, when the price had reached almost astronomical heights, several times what they'd have cost in the shops, and Omri was beginning to despair of Tamsin's greed ever being satisfied, the bargain was struck. The little figures were detached, the better part of Omri's $5 handed over, and Emma and Omri found themselves out in the hall again, tiptoeing toward the front door. Where do you think you're going, Emma? They stopped cold. Emma shut her eyes. It was her mother this time, the sister of Patrick's mother, and just like another, it seemed. And Omri thought, good, she'll have to stop here, and that means I won't have to be bothered with her. She'd served her purpose, and surely the fewer people who were involved, the better. But he glanced sideways at Emma's face, and to his own astonishment, he heard himself saying, Could Emma come back to my place for lunch? Emma's mother said, Well, how will she get home? My dad'll run her back, said Omri glibly, before dark. Of course. Oh, all right then, I suppose. They gave her no time to think twice. They were out and down the street as fast as they could run. Now, said Emma as they sat on the train going back to Omri's district, I want to know everything. Omri groaned inwardly. He'd managed to fend off his questions on the way to her house, but there was something in the voice that told her that no amount of fending would work now. He turned in his seat to face her. Listen, Em, you've got to swear yourself to secrecy. Okay, she agreed readily. No, not like that. It's not just a game. You don't know how hard it's going to be to keep this to yourself. With Tamsin for a sister, I've learned how to keep secrets. Don't you worry. Omri slumped back against the train seat. He'd have to trust her, and it was too late not to. Okay, then. You saw them. They're real. They're no dream and no game. There's proper magic in this world to do with time and the souls of people that can travel in time and from place to place and enter things like toys and make them come to life. And we can travel too. I mean, our spirits can, and that's where Patrick is. He's time traveling. Emma was staring at him. Why is it a secret? Can't you see if the grown-ups knew? Oh, yeah, not just grown-ups, if Tamsin knew. We wouldn't be allowed to keep it. It works. I might as well tell you this with a special key and a little bathroom cupboard and my oak chest. All that would be taken away. There'd be newspapers and TV. Emma sat up straight, her eyes alight. Would we be on TV? Omri's heart plummeted. Emma, you mustn't. You must not think like that. Yeah, we'd be on TV and everything would be ruined. Emma sat back frowning. He could see her thinking. He had the feeling she wasn't particularly used to thinking seriously any more than he'd been himself before all this started. They hurried along the length of Hobble Road unmolested. The skinhead gang had gone, home for lunch presumably. As they half ran, Emma said, Where exactly has Patrick gone? Well, said Omri, I'm pretty worried about that. And he explained how the key worked as best he could. You have to take someone or something real or alive with you if you want to go back to a specific place or time. Like when I went back to the Indian village last night, I took a pair of Bright Star's moccasins in my pocket. Patrick took Boone, but he forgot the rules, and as he went, Boone came back. So he could be anywhere, just floating about in time? I don't know. The only thing is, what? Well, it's only a slight hope, but I'm sure Boone, his plastic figure, was wearing his hat when Patrick set off, and maybe the hat got caught up in some sort of time current and attached itself to Patrick, in which case he went to Texas after all because that's where the hat belongs. Complicated, isn't it? Said Emma. Yeah, you said it. But he glanced at her appreciatively. She was taking it pretty reasonably, and she was fun. And it wasn't bad at all having someone else to help now that Patrick had PO'd. As they reached the house, it occurred to Omri as ironic that the whole business with Patrick going back in time had come up in the first place, so Patrick wouldn't have to go home so he could stay and help Omri. Huh, thought Omri, some fine friend. But Patrick was his friend, and even at times like this, when Omri was fed up with him, like now, he still liked him enough to care what was happening to him. Omri and Emma hurried up to Omri's room. Omri's first act was to bend over the longhouse and call softly, Matron. She came out. She didn't bustle quite so briskly now. Her starched apron was soiled, and her magnificent cap was limp and askew. She looked very tired. Well, what luck? How's Boone? Asked Omri. How are the others? Your cowboy friend is a bit better, although he's still unconscious, but he's breathing normally, but he's badly bruised. The Indians? Her shoulders slumped a little. One is hanging between life and death. Bullet in the trachea. Another in the leg. I need help desperately. We brought you some. She straightened up with the relief. Even the erstwhile magnificent cap seemed to stiffen a little. Well, what are we waiting for? Let's get to it. Emma, meanwhile, had lost no time in consigning the medical team to the cupboard, and just before Omri closed the door, Emma peered at the seed tray and suddenly said, Whose are those sweet little horses? Sweet little horses? Jeez, thought Omri, gritting his teeth, but he kept his temper and said, The brown one's Little Bear's. The black one belongs to the cowboy. Can I put the cowboy one back in the cupboard? What for? Well, I want to see how it works in reverse, and you said Patrick might be in Boone's time. Maybe he needs a horse. Don't be stupid. Patrick will be small like the little people are here. What use would a sock and great horse be to him? He couldn't possibly ride it. Still, let me. Omri couldn't be bothered making any more objections, and Emma tenderly lifted the little black horse between finger and thumb and put it in the cupboard. Will it go back at the same time as the doctors come forward? Yeah, come on, let's get on with it, said Omri impatiently. The door was closed on the little live horse and the plastic men, and the key was turned. Emma, her ear to the mirrored door, grinned ecstatically at Omri. She could hear tiny voices questioning each other in the darkness, and her hand went to the key, but Omri stopped her. Listen, he said quietly. One of the tricky things is that when they see us, trying to get them to believe it or not think they lost their minds. Our best bet with these modern people is to get Matron to explain. Matron was ready and eager, impatient to get the team out and to work on her patients. "Leave it to me," she said. "Just let me in that cupboard." "But what will you say?" "I've thought it all out," she said. "Most men, if you just tell them what to do in a business-like fashion, will follow directions without thinking about it. One proceeds on the assumption that they'll do as they're told, and they do. However, they may be forced to think a bit if they see you two, so I suggest you keep out of the way." She nipped back into the longhouse, presumably to make sure everything was in perfect order, and then hurried out down the ramp and across the cupboard. "Right you are," she said. "Open sesame." As she slid through the partly open door, Henri put his hand stealthily at the top and lifted out the plastic figure of Boone's horse. "Here," he muttered to Emma. "This was your daft idea. You better take care of it." She took the little figure from him and looked into its plastic face. "He's happy to be home," she said mysteriously. "Now Patrick isn't completely on his own anyway." Now we're back in Patrick's time, back in the 1800s. Remember, he's stuck out in the desert with, looks like a dead or barely breathing Boone. Patrick brooded, his head on his hands, his elbows on his bent knees. He was sitting in the massive shadow of Boone's corpse. He thought maybe a dead body. Not that Patrick allowed himself to think this in so many words, but he was quite sure in the back of his mind that that's what it was. Trying to think, and at the same time trying not to think. The two conflicting efforts canceled each other out, and his mind was blank and his eyes were unfocused. But suddenly they did focus. They focused on something he hadn't noticed before. Heaven knows why, because it was absolutely enormous. A vast black mountain range on the horizon, and it was moving. It was heaving. It was threshing. One part of it at the far left end of the range was rearing itself up into the sky. So what was just sent back to where they're at? The horse, right? Patrick sprang to his feet and shaded his eyes. The vast black mass was erupting in a series of bounding curves and angular jolts. It was awesome, like witnessing the primeval forces that created the world, throwing up volcanic ranges like from the hot lava center of the earth. But abruptly, Henri lost his sense of awe and terror. He threw back his head and laughed. Because now the mountain range finished heaving and stood upright on four titanic legs, revealing at once what it was. It was a horse. It must have been lying motionless in what to Patrick was the distance, its spirit or whatever, somewhere far away in place and time, and now it had come back to itself and stood up, and cripes, it was lumbering toward him. Patrick ran, and he ran back toward the sheltering bulk of Boone. He hid himself under the vast flap that was the lapel of Boone's plaid shirt collar, tucked under his bristly chin. As Patrick ducked behind this flannel curtain, he heard a strange, almost musical sound like a wheezing groan. A huge fleshy knob just above the neckband moved, along and then back, making the shirt collar shiver and shift. At first Patrick had no notion of what was happening, but as the groaning sound went on and the motion in the lump of Boone's throat continued, he suddenly realized. Frightened though he was, the thundering tread of those colossal hooves was shaking the ground like a series of earthquakes as they approached. Patrick registered with an incredulous sense of relief that the bristly skin above the shirt was warm and that the groaning sounds were rasping breaths and that the lump was Boone's Adam's apple. "Boone, you're alive," Patrick breathed, feeling a sudden intense happiness. Now, he wasn't alive, right? That's why he wasn't moving or breathing, but Matron brought him back to life with Henri's help. He almost kissed the Adam's apple as it slid past him. But then he sensed the horse's tremendous head coming down at him, and he crouched trembling behind the collar. He felt a rush of hot, powerfully horse-scented breath that came right through the thick flannel. Then there was a loud sound like the rumble of distant thunder as the horse blew through its lip. The horse was smelling Boone. Next it nudged the cowboy's shoulder with its nose, causing another sort of earthquake that had Patrick rolling over on the stones. He peered out from behind the flap. The first thing he saw, vast as it was recognizable as a hoof. The slopey, horny part was about twice Patrick's height, with a fringe of coarse black hair hanging over the top of it. Patrick never knew afterwards what possessed him to take the action he now took almost unthinkingly. He knew he had to get out of this desert unless he wanted to die of heat stroke, thirst, or the attentions of wild creatures. He needed to escape, so instinctively he acted. He took a run at the hoof, scrambled halfway up the hard slope of hands and feet, grabbed a handful of the coarse black hair. Now he's going up this horse's foot and going to grab the hair that's hanging down over the hoof. Hauled himself up to a kind of a ledge where the gigantic leg bone started. There he almost panicked. The hoof he was on was planted firmly in the sand, but at some stage it would start to move, probably very fast, and Patrick looked at the tempting slope to the ground and nearly slid straight back down again into short-term safety. But then he thought, no, I must get out of here, and this is the only way. He hurriedly took several of the long black hairs of the horse's fetlock, twisted them together, and knotted them firmly around his waist. Then he reached as high as he could and took a strong grip with both hands of more of the hairs and at the same time bracing his sneakers on the ridge at the top of the hoof. He felt surprisingly secure, ready for anything, so he thought. He had absolutely no idea of the terrifying experience that was in store for him when the horse, getting no response from its prostrate master, abruptly threw up its head, turned swiftly, and started to gallop across the desert sand. Patrick had always loved terrifying rides at fairs. The scarier the better. The centrifugal drum was one of his favorites, and that rocket that spins and plunges and twists and whirls about all the time. But no fair ride ever dreamed up by an ingenious showman could compare with the standing braced on the hoof of a giant horse as it races over hot sand. Think about that. Up, down, up, down, up, down, and he's tied on there. Over and over again, the great hoof would rise up in the air, leaving Patrick's stomach far below, and sweep through a monstrous arc that had Patrick dangling high above the sand. If he hadn't tied himself on securely, nothing would have saved him. The hoof was bent and turned in such a way that his body would be twisted and flung almost upside down, before the hoof plunged down again to strike the ground with a sickening jar. The speed alone was enough to make most people faint, but Patrick grimly hung on. Yet his hand grips became weaker and weaker as the crazy, fantastic, nerve and bone-racking ride went on and on. To make matters worse, dust and stones struck up from the ground by the flying hooves, flew through the air, and pelted Patrick all over. He didn't feel these at the time. Every bit of his mind and every muscle and sinew were preoccupied with the single task of holding on. He didn't know that his eyes were screwed shut, that his breath was coming in jolts, and that with every breath he uttered a cry or a groan. For him, all was a sickening motion, whirling blackness, jarring blows, and absolute terror. By the time it stopped, he was almost unconscious. His handholds had given way, although one wrist was still held by a tangle of hairs. He hung from this and the tie at his waist like a rag doll. His whole body was covered with bruises, his throat was choked with dust so he could scarcely draw a breath. Gradually he came back to his senses and straightened up painfully. He opened his eyes with difficulty. They were caked with wind tears and dust. He peered dazedly around him. There seemed to be a lot going on, noise, movement. At his level, near the ground, he could see a lot of other huge hooves moving and stamping. The ground itself was not sand, but packed earth. There was a very strong horse smell, probably dung. That's like horse potty. He raised his eyes and saw some vast posts and a rail and the heads of a number of horses beside his own. Straight before him was a wooden cliff about 6 times Patrick's height. Now, when you look over by the board over here behind the black bookshelf by the door, there is a picture of Sterling back when we had wooden sidewalks and dirt roads back in the 1800s. And this is pretty much where they're at now. They've come to a town that looks like that. The hoof he was still attached to lifted and made a pawing movement that brought it level with the top of the cliff, and Patrick saw what it was, the edge of a wooden sidewalk. And now he could see gigantic feet, some in cowboy boots with villainous spurs attached, others in lighter footwear, all but covered by long skirts, striding past with fast steps that thundered on the boards. Patrick took advantage of the horse's hoof being for the moment planted on the sidewalk to free himself just as well. No sooner had he slid down the sloping hoof to the wooden floor than the horse's head swept down, and its giant slabs of teeth as big as tombstones bit scratchingly into its fetlock, exactly where Patrick had been tied a moment before. So the horse probably felt him and went down to bite, and he just missed because he just got off. It was dangerous to try to cross the sidewalk. Any one of those mighty, thundering feet could crush him on the way. From his viewpoint, it was like trying to make it across a 10-lane highway during rush hour. So check out these feet. We've got over here, we've got a cowboy boot with the spurs. There's Patrick way over here. That's a woman's boots with the petticoats. Those are called petticoats. Interesting. What was he going to do? He couldn't stay here. So, already the horse was snuffling at him, nearly sucking him up in its cavernous nostril. Patrick ran out of range and found himself surrounded by the feet. He must get out of here. He must find someone to help him. Just then he saw some boots coming to a standstill right beside him, and curiously they were not brown or black, but bright red and shiny. One scarlet lace was coming untied and hung down to the ground, and Patrick put his head back as far as he could go and looked upward. He could see a whole sky of frothy white petticoats and the hem of a red satin dress a long way above him. It was a lady. So again, do you see the lady's boots? You see the petticoats? They wore those underneath their dresses. She had come up from the sidewalk onto the sidewalk from the dirt road and had paused for a moment. And again he acted without thinking. He grabbed the red bootlace and heaved himself up, although he ached in every limb, onto the arched instep where he could find comfortable and safe refuge among the crossed red laces and metal-ringed lace holes. I'm safe, he thought. That was his opinion.